So this is part B or part 2 of bones and skeletal system. So where we left off was what happens in the fetus. In the fetus, you are going to lay down bone, and then once the baby's born, that bone is going to grow and develop and so forth and so on. There are two major classifications of bone. You have your flat bones, such as the bones in your skull, and they're for protection. And then you'll have long bones, and they are for between the long bones and the joints and this, that, and the other thing. That's the rest of the skeleton, such as your appendicular skeleton, and that is going to be developed quite differently in the fetus than the flat bones. So flat bone development in the fetus is called intramembranous ossification. And then the second part is called endochondral ossification. That's going to be the development of long bones. We're going to do the development of flat bones first, and then long bones second. So the first is going to be intramembranous ossification of the flat bones, and then endochondral ossification of the long bones. So it says now ossification means that's when you're going to go from something that is quite soft, that is not going to bear weight, to something that is highly calcified and can bear weight. And ossification is kind of the overall term for taking bone that might be a bit on the soft side and hardening it, ossifying it. So it says ossification center appears in the fibrous connective tissue. Bone matrix is secreted within the fibrous membrane. Woven bone and periosteum form. Bone collar of compact bone forms, and red bone marrow appears. The thing about intramembranous ossification in the fetus is, remember that fetal development is a process, and the fetus is an ever-growing entity, and the tissue and cells in a fetus are in an immature state. Once upon a time, you and I were a fertilized egg, and then 9 months later, ta-da, a baby. But during that process, you don't go from a fertilized egg to let's say, a newborn baby automatically. You do it in steps, and the steps mean that the cells that are in the early embryo that will then become the cells of the fetus undergo differentiation. In other words, they will start off as very undifferentiated cells with all the potential in the world until they start to make decisions. And the decisions are a carefully regulated process, and the decisions that are made for flat bone run different than for long bone. And so for flat bone, here we go. See these cells here and here and here, these, what would I call them? Gray looking cells. They are embryonic cells that are called mesenchyme. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Are called mesenchyme. There we are. Mesenchymal cells. And mesenchyme means middle. And these are embryonic cells that are trying to form the middle of the fetus. That's going to be a bone. That's going to be a muscle. And so mesenchyme cells that are in this region are going to become bone, versus other mesenchymal cells in other parts of the fetus will become muscle. And there are a lot of signals that I'm not going to go into that occur at different stages of fetal development. And in this particular case, where you're going to be putting your flat bone, these mesenchymal cells receive signals there where they will mature into bone making cells called osteoblasts. So it's like insto presto, mesenchymal cells become osteoblasts. Yay! And the osteoblasts are going to start to make bone. And the maturation of the osteoblasts into osteocytes are going to occur in the wink of an eye. And this area where you have the bone-making cells are called the ossification center. So next, I'm going to fast forward to what happens at the end. As the process continues, you are going to be having more and more mesenchyme cells become osteoblasts. They then are going to form on the edges compact bone, in the middle spongy bone, which is also called diploid. And the spongy bone is needed not only for red bone marrow deposition, also for blood vessels like capillaries to weave in and out, because just like bone, they have bone cells. If they're trapped in a bony matrix, they are osteocytes, and then again, you do need to get your blood vessels to them. And the same thing with spongy bone. You're going to still have living bone-making cells, and you want to keep them alive. But in the end, the interesting thing about, the compact bone in flat bones is you just have the two surfaces of the compact and the inner surface of the spongy, and it's called intramembranous. Why intramembranous? Because what it's trying to get at is that in that area where you're going to be making the flat bone are these mesenchymal cells that will then differentiate into osteoblasts. And then once that happens now they're talking about the membrane of the periosteum and the endosteum, but then once you've got the mesenchyme into osteoblasts, hey, they start making bone, so they will start to ossify. But it's very direct. Not so much with endochondral ossification. But the bones, the long bones of the skeleton, are complicated. They have spongy bone, they have compact bone, they have a medullary cavity, they have lots of canals, they have, all sorts of different areas. So the way that it develops in a fetus is more complicated. The other thing that has to happen with long bones is they have to grow quickly. Now, skull bones have to grow a little bit and they will fuse over time, but it's not the same type of growth. Babies are born about 15 inches and then they get to be, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot, maybe 6 feet in a relatively short period of time. And for that expansion to occur, it doesn't happen with your skull. Your skull does not become massively huge, but your long bones, relatively speaking, become massively long. And until puberty hits, they want to be able to expand. So the way that they do it is to put down a matrix of a material that can be easily expanded, and it's called cartilage. If you wiggle your nose or wiggle your ears, that's cartilage. And nobody stands on their head, on their nose. That would not be too swift. And that has a lot to do with the fact that cartilage, although it does have certain form, your nose has a form, your ears have forms, but then it's not particularly hard, and it's not easy. Well, it's not particularly hard, let's put it that way. So, but you can expand it really fast. And that's the reason for the endo. So what's inside the fetus, where you're going to form long bones, are chondrocytes making cartilage. That's why it's called chondral. But eventually, you want to replace that cartilage with hard, ossified bone. Now, could the body think of a different way of expanding long bones? Sure, but this is what we're stuck with. So it's a little counterintuitive. It's like you're going to start as the fetus to make cartilage, and that's going to be your skeleton. But indeed, it has to do with the fact that it has to grow long quickly, and cartilage is much easier to expand and then replace. So in the second month of development, you're going to make hyaline cartilage, bones, as models for bone construction. So you're going to basically construct it in cartilage first, and then you're going to replace it with ossified bone. And it therefore requires, after you start this process, to eventually break down the hyaline cartilage in order to ossify and harden that bone. And away we go. So here are the stages that I'm going to simplify. It says formation of bone collar, cavitation of the hyaline cartilage, invasion of the cavities by the periosteal bud, and spongy bone formation, the formation of the medullary cavity, the appearance of secondary ossification centers in the epiphysis, and the ossification of the epiphysis with hyaline cartilage. And the only thing that has remained is the epiphyseal plate. So I get to translate all of that. So here we go. In the fetus, where you are going to form long bone, you put cartilage. These are going to be chondrocytes are going to make cartilage, and osteoblasts are going to make bone. So the first thing that you do is you're going to lay down the fetal skeleton of long bones in this blue cartilage made by chondrocytes. And the first place where you're going to ossify is going to be this mid piece. So that is your diaphysis. And the blood vessels invade and will deliver osteoblasts. And osteoblasts make bone. Now, they are more aggressive about making bone than chondrocytes are making cartilage. So as you have the growth of the osteoblasts, you will replace the cartilage and the chondrocytes with ossified bone. So it first happens here in the diaphysis, so it's called the primary ossification center. This is still in the fetus. And then the top and the bottom, you're going to have blood vessels invade thereafter. And those are going to be your secondary ossification centers. They should have a blood vessel down here, but they don't. And that means the epiphysis is ossified afterwards. This continues, this cycle of having the osteoblasts outcompete the chondrocytes and replace the cartilage with ossified bone, until in the end you are just left with one center and a second center of cartilage, of chondrocytes making cartilage, and they are called the growth plates. So you have a growth plate here and you have a growth plate here. So you have a growth plate between the primary and the secondary ossification center, and you have a second growth plate between the bottom primary and secondary ossification center. And that will continue until adolescence, because babies have to grow, toddlers have to grow, children grow until they reach sexual maturity. And they grow by having the chondrocytes make cartilage, and then that'll expand the bone, and then you will replace that with your osteoblasts that are going to replace the chondrocytes and the cartilage with bone. And this is a more complicated explanation, but just the explanation that I gave is what you're responsible for. Okay, so how do you go from an infant to an adult? And an infant is, I don't know, 15, 20 inches, to an adult that's 5'10". And this has to do with a hormone called growth hormone. And growth hormone is made by the thyroid gland, and it is in cycles. So you're going to have a increase in growth hormone, a decrease in growth hormone, an increase in growth hormone, and a decrease in growth hormone. And this cyclic nature of growth hormone has a very definite effect on long bone. Now, here's the trick. Growth hormone only stimulates chondrocytes to make cartilage. Growth hormone in no manner, shape, or form is going to stimulate any bone-making cell at all. Growth hormone has no effect on osteoblasts, osteocytes, or osteoclasts. None whatsoever. And so what happens in a child as they start to grow? The level of growth hormone will peak, and then chondrocytes will make more cartilage because they can grow and multiply, and the bone expands. But then growth hormone is going to levels are going to go down. This is kind of the natural course. It's going to go up, it's going to go down. It's going to go up, it's going to go down. And that's going to be kind of individual for individual kids, but it's always going to be, it's going to be a spike in growth hormone, and then it's going to go down. When it goes down, then the chondrocytes stop making cartilage, and that gives the osteoblasts the upper hand, and then they will start to replace the chondrocytes and cartilage with bone. And then growth hormone peaks again. And then in that growth plate, growth hormone will stimulate the chondrocytes and the cartilage to expand, and the bone grows. And then growth hormone goes down, and then the osteoblasts will replace the chondrocytes and the cartilage. And so it goes. So you are going to have this constant cycle go on, and that is how the child gets from 15 inches to 5'5". So as the child is growing, there will be a growth zone, and that's usually located in the growth plates, which are also called epiphyseal plates. And then there's going to be a transition. This is going to be the transition between cartilage and bone. And then the osteogenic area is where you have active replacement of the cartilage and chondrocytes with osteoblasts and calcified bone. All right, so here we go. Growth hormone, or at the growth plates or the epiphyseal plates. But then what happens at puberty? At puberty, you have suddenly the production of the sex hormones of estrogen and testosterone. And when that happens, the sex hormones of estrogen and progesterone are going to eventually, right? They're going to initially promote growth spurts. It can obviously cause masculinization and feminization of specific parts of the skeleton. Now, here's the part that's the most important. It's going to close the growth plate. It's going to close the epiphyseal plate. What the sex hormones will eventually do is destroy chondrocytes. And then that's it. You have reached your adult height. You will grow no more. You will look forward to aging and shrinking, but you will grow no taller. And thanks to sex hormones. So when the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate closes because the sex hormones destroy the chondrocytes, hey, then there are no cells left that are going to be able to respond to growth hormone. Other parts of your body will respond to it. It's not like you stop making growth hormone, you do. And that helps your heart, and that helps your smooth muscle, and that helps your skeletal muscle until the day you die. But you are not going to have any chondrocytes to respond to growth hormone anymore because they're dead thanks to sex hormones. So why do you keep all of those bone cells alive? And you do that because of bone remodeling in the adult. So it says that adjacent osteoblasts and osteoclasts will deposit and resorb bone respectively. In other words, you want to be able until, like with women with menopause and men when they get older, be able to deposit excess calcium. Osteoblasts will do that to you, and your bones become denser. And at other times, serum calcium levels fall, and then you have to keep those at a homeostatic level. So in some cases, you're going to have osteoclasts resorb the bone and move that from the bone into the blood, which is what we will discuss next. All right, so why in God's name do you need serum calcium? You need serum calcium because calcium is absolutely positively necessary for transmission of nerve impulses, muscle contraction, that's going to be skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, and calcium is also necessary for proper blood coagulation. So where do they get it? They get it from serum calcium. Serum calcium is soluble, and kind of the challenge is going to be, how do you get soluble calcium into bone and calcify it, or how do you get calcified calcium out of the bone into the blood in a soluble form? And of course, you can do that. We're going to talk about the hormonal mechanisms rather than mechanical and gravitational forces. All right, so if you have a lot of blood calcium, I don't know, you drank a gallon of milk, and so some of that calcium will go into proper nerve transmission and muscle function and blah blah, and then the excess can go into the bone and store it in case you need it later on. So the thyroid, some of the cells are very sensitive to excess blood calcium, and they will release a hormone called calcitonin. And calcitonin is going to stimulate calcium salt deposition in bone by osteoblasts. So what the osteoblasts actually do is this. Under the auspices of calcitonin, calcitonin will stimulate the osteoblast to take the excess blood calcium into the cell, and what comes out of the cell is calcified form of calcium that can contribute to ossification and deposition of the calcium into the bone matrix. All right, so let's say that you have only eaten celery sticks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and your calcium levels in your blood fall. There's not a whole lot of calcium in celery. And that then is going to signal that the parathyroid is associated with the thyroid gland, but it's a separate endocrine system. And the low blood calcium causes parathyroid to release parathyroid hormone. Now, it says parathyroid hormone signals osteoclast to degrade bone matrix and release calcium into the blood. So these osteoclasts, these bone-destroying cells, are going to be stimulated by the parathyroid hormone to take insoluble calcium from the bone matrix, pass it through the cell. What comes out the other side is soluble calcium that can be put into the blood, so the blood serum calcium levels rise back to homeostasis in order for your brain to work and your heart to work and blood clotting to work. And the next slide, which should be the last slide, is a lovely little picture. I tend to be a visual person, so I get more out of these than I do from the previous slide. So here you have an imbalance where you would have too much blood calcium. Thyroid produces calcitonin, which then stimulates the osteoblast to take the soluble calcium to insoluble and deposit it in the bone matrix. If the blood serum calcium levels get too low, then the parathyroid glands, these are these little glands right here that are kind of on the underneath of the thyroid, is going to produce parathyroid hormone that stimulate osteoclasts to take the calcified insoluble from the bone matrix and solubilize it into the blood so that the calcium levels in the serum come back to homeostasis. And that's what you do all the time. You don't grow any taller, but it's always that back and forth between depositing and extracting calcium in order for the serum calcium levels to remain homeostatic. And that's it. So the next time I do a PowerPoint, it's going to be on muscle. So I'll see you there.